the relationship between the translation and the original, that is, how close a translation should be to the original, or how far away it can stray, is the subject of an age-old argument. Historically, there have been two distinct and opposite schools of thought. One that insisted that the translation should be as close to the original as possible, and the other that suggested that the translation should be adapted to the taste of the reader, and that the translator should feel as free in his or her creative process as needs be. These two opposite approaches are traditionally called literal translation and free translation, or, speaking in the most recent terms introduced by an American theorist Lawrence Venuti, foreignization and domestication of translation. Both approaches have their merits. The one that demands fidelity to the original tries to present the author's ideas, imagery, and style most faithfully, but the resultant translation may be difficult to read. On the other hand, free translation offers more natural, more graceful, more fluent texts, which, however, may miss a lot of the author's original intention. Now, as I say, this argument is really very old. It goes back at least to the time of Cicero. It is in fact so old that it's become quite banal and uninteresting for the late 20th century theorists. In the Soviet Union, however, which was creating its own theory of translation in the 1920s, 1960s, this dichotomy was still very much alive, and it was regarded in Hegelian terms as a thesis, an antithesis, and synthesis. Literal translation being a thesis, free translation being the antithesis, and the expectation was that the Soviet school will eventually synthesize these two extremes and will develop the best method of literary translation. In 1971, though, a Russian scholar, Mikhail Gasparov, came up with another model of relationship between these two approaches to translation. He emphasized that translation is a phenomenon that lies at the intersection of two cultures, two languages, two traditions, and can therefore lean to one culture, language, and tradition, or to the other culture, language, and tradition. As a matter of fact, he argued that as a culture develops, it favors first one approach, then the other. So there's the period of more free translation, then a period of more literal translation, then again a period of more free translation, then again a period of more literal translation, and so on. Gasparov offered, as an example of his idea, the history of translation in Russia, a period of domesticating translation, which was the 18th century classicism, was then succeeded by the foreignizing translation of the early 19th century Romanticism, then again by domesticating translation during the late 19th century Realism, then by foreignizing translation again of the early 20th century Modernism, and then by the Soviet period of translation. Now, writing in the 1970s, Gasparov could not really say anything that would be construed as disrespectful towards the Soviet tradition of translation. So here is how he described this. Early 20th century modernism, he wrote, in its turn went back to the program of exact or literal translation. Brusov is Valery Brusov, a very significant figure during the Silver Age of the Russian poetry. Brusov went farther than others, but his general principles, not to impoverish the original in order to satisfy the reader's tastes, but to enrich the reader's tastes so that he can better perceive the original, were shared by all translators of that age. The Soviet era is a reaction to modernist literalism. It balances the extremes and offers a program of clarity, fluency, and faithfulness to the Russian literary tradition. Here is the graphic representation of the period that I'm going to talk about. it shows a movement from the tendency to foreignization among the Russian modernists towards the domestication that we had during the mature Soviet period. And although this schematic can be a gross oversimplification, as many schematics are, I still think it will be useful to keep it in mind while I move on to the main part of my talk, namely to the two Soviet translations of Byron's Don Juan. There were at least 4 attempts to translate Don Juan during the Soviet period, but 2 of them remained unfinished and therefore were largely unknown. The 2 translators who completed and published their work were Georgy Shengeli and Tatiana Gnedich. As if by miracle, they were working almost simultaneously in the 1940s, and at least at first they were working independently from one another. Both of them entered the classical Soviet text on translation criticism, but, and here lies the main difference, while Gnedich's translation was highly praised and was treated as exemplary, Shengeli's translation was harshly criticized and basically vilified. So what is so different about these 2 translations? Let me begin with Shengeli. His translation appeared first. Shengeli was a very interesting and at the same time a very complicated figure. He was a translator of poetry as well as an original poet. He was born in 1894 and he matured in the atmosphere of the Silver Age of the Russian poetry, the very modernism that I talked about. He was deeply influenced by Valery Brusov, whom I already mentioned. He considered himself a disciple of Valery Brusov, and Brusov was also a very interesting poet and in his late years an extreme foreignizer. He made an attempt, for example, to translate Virgil's Aeneid into Russian, reproducing the original Latin syntax, by which he shocked practically all of his readers. Shengeli was not as extreme as Brusov. He didn't care that much about syntax, but still, the main virtue of translation for Shengeli was its exactness, how faithfully it reproduced the contents and the imagery of the original. In the 1930s, he started translating Byron, and since he was an extremely prolific translator, he actually translated the whole body of Byron's works, all his poems, his plays, Childe Harold, finally Don Juan. He started working on Don Juan in 1941, which obviously was not a particularly good time because of the war between Soviet Union and Germany, which soon erupted. So he was, as many other Muscovites were, he was evacuated to Central Asia, where he continued working on his translation in rather lamentable conditions. As I said, Shengeli valued fidelity to the original above everything else. So he made an interesting and a rather unusual move, especially for that time. He said he couldn't squeeze all that was going on in Byron's Don Juan into the same meter, the same iambic pentameter. So he changed the meter to iambic hexameter, and he actually wrote an afterword to his translation where he explained his choice. He theorized about the contemporary practice to always keep the original meter in translation, and he claimed that it was not really a sound requirement, because sometimes it is really impossible to keep the same meter in translation due to the radical differences between the versification systems of 2 literatures. And since it is not always to always keep the same meter, why should there be a requirement, for instance, for all poets from English and Russian to keep the same meter in their translation? So instead he advocated a functional approach to choosing the meter, and he said that for Don Juan he needed an iambic hexameter. His translation was eventually published in 1947. It did not make much of an impact at first, went more or less unnoticed for 3 years. Then in 1950 it was attacked at a translation conference, and then followed another series of attacks. The person who criticized Szengeli the most was this man, Ivan Kashkin. He wrote at least 3 critical papers against Szengeli, the last and the most devastating of which was Tradition and Paganism, published in December 1952. What didn't Kashkin like about Szengeli's translation? Well, pretty much everything, which makes me think that there was a strong element of personal enmity, personal animosity between these two people. Kashkin didn't like the iambic hexameter, he didn't like the foreign borrowings or the archaic words that Szengeli sometimes used, or Szengeli's syntax, or his attempts to reproduce Byron's puns and wordplay. But what was the most devastating of all, he accused Szengeli of misrepresenting Suvorov in his translation, of distorting the image of Suvorov, as he put it, and of slandering both Suvorov and the Russian soldiers. In 1952, when the Russians had just won the war and were feeling superior to other nations, and when Stalin was still alive and apparently was preparing the next round of purges, this was extremely dangerous. Suvorov was one of the favorite Stalin's military leaders, so an accusation of slander against Suvorov could have had deadly repercussions. I will return to the concrete examples shortly, but now I'll move on to Tatiana Gnedich. If Szengeli translated Don Juan in a shabby dark building in Central Asia, Gnedich famously translated Don Juan in prison. She was arrested for political charges in the very end of 1943, and in prison, since she remembered a canto from Don Juan by heart, in fact it was Canto 9, she started translating it. Later she showed her translation to a KGB officer who was investigating her case, and amazingly, the officer became interested in her project and helped her to get the original of Don Juan, an English-Russian dictionary, some paper and pencils. And so within 2 years, Gnedich finished her translation. She was then sentenced to 10 years of labor camps, which she served, and then she returned to Leningrad, or at least to the suburbs of Leningrad, in 1955. By that time, Szengeli's translation had already been condemned as inadequate, so the timing to publish another translation of Don Juan could not have been more appropriate. Gnedich presented her translation, received favorable reviews, and it was arranged that her translation should be published, which it eventually was, in 1959. But, before that, for over a year, she carefully went through her translation with an editor and meticulously revised it. It is during this period, I believe, that she became acquainted with the criticism of Szengeli's work and took it into consideration while preparing her own translation. I don't have a definitive proof of that. Sadly, the first typewritten manuscript of Gnedich's translation is unavailable, but the following examples are strongly indicative of this. So, this is Canto 7, stanza 55, and it is a stanza. What I'm going to discuss now are the stanzas, the examples from which were criticized in Ivan Kashkin's paper against Szengeli's translation. So this stanza, Kashkin said, it is central in showing the character of Suvorov. So I'm not going to read all of it, but what I want to draw your attention to are the last 2 lines of the stanza. When bent to storm a fortress, Suvorov was harlequin in uniform. Szengeli, who is on the right, reproduced that, and he put this harlequin in uniform in the very end of the last line. In fact, the word harlequin became the very last word. Now, Kashkin said that since harlequin is in the very end of the line, where it rhymes with the previous word, it is in a strong position. Therefore, Szengeli is showing Suvorov mainly as a harlequin, which it was not good. On the left-hand side, you see translation by Tatiana Gnedic, and you probably will observe that the column with the translation of Tatiana Gnedic is more narrow. This means that Tatiana Gnedic used the original Byron's iambic pentameter, but since she was no magician, and the Russian words are longer than the English ones, to produce that iambic pentameter, she had to throw something away. In this particular case, well, she has the harlequin, which she moved in there into the middle of the line so that it would not be in the rhyming position. She removed the words like buffoon, half demon, half dirt, which are not precisely complementary. And the very last line, which does not appear in the Byron sex, reads, "He was a genius in every battle." This is also a stanza about Suvorov. Here he was the greatest chief that ever peopled hell with heroes slain or plunged the province or realm in grief, which is quite closely translated by Szengeli. And while in fact the grief in Byron is translated as mrak и отчаяние, the darkness and despair, so Suvorov was plunging provinces or realms in darkness and despair, and Kashkin said that no, that's too much. And Kashkin also didn't like that Suvorov populated the hell with heroes slain. Possibly it was not a very positive characteristic of Suvorov. So in Gnedic's variant, she in fact removed all those three lines. So Suvorov does not plunge a province or realm in grief, and he does not populate the hell with heroes. This is a stanza about the Russian soldiers who are trained by Suvorov. Here Suvorov is exclaiming and swearing at the inert and lecturing the soldiers on the noble art of killing, which is, well, the noble art of killing is translated very precisely by Szengeli, and the inert are translated as рохли и увольни, which is more or less lazy and clumsy, or lazy and inept. And these characteristics, the lazy and clumsy, or the lazy and inept, were considered slanderous for the Russian soldiers, for the Russian army. Gnedic, obviously, and Kashkin also did not like the noble art of killing. He did not like this noble part, although it is in the original. So Gnedic does not have the noble art of killing, it is just the art of killing, and her soldiers are clumsy or tired. But the best part is here, I think, she condescends to them. She says, "Poor man, clumsy or tired, poor man," sympathizing with them. Another stanza. The Russian soldiers with Kutuzov are in a ditch, trying to attack the fortress. The Turks are firing back, and the Russians are in an unfavorable position, so they are afraid for their lives. So they took, like chameleons, some slight tinge of fear, which is translated exactly by Szengeli, and which was again harshly criticized by Kashkin. This again was claimed this was slanderous. And
Gnedic, in her variant, does not, well, she removes this line, and the only sign of distress is that the soldiers do not observe the line while attacking the Turks. Just very briefly, this stanza and the next stanza are characteristic in that in Szengely's translation, both these stanzas, he uses the word grabеж. In this particular stanza, he uses this word to translate spoil, danger and spoil, that the Russian soldiers were seeking. Now, grabеж is something that can be translated into English as pillage or plunder, not exactly a positive thing about the soldiers. And this word, this grabеж, it attracted quite a lot of criticism, that the Russian soldiers were so mercantile. So Gnedic uses the word trophies here, and in another line where Szengely used grabеж to translate cash and conquest, Gnedic uses the heroic spirit. Each heroic bosom burned for cash and conquest became that Suvorov was heating up the heroic spirit in his soldiers. And this is the last stanza I want to show you, and it is not very demonstrative for my purpose, but still I love it because both translations make the very same mistake, and Szengely obviously did not understand what was going on, what was said, and I do not really know about Gnedic whether she did not understand that as well or preferred not to understand. Now, Suvorov, who but saw things in the gross, being much too gross to see them in detail, this second line, being much too gross to see them in detail, the Oxford English Dictionary says that gross in here means dull, insensitive, brutish. Now, in both translations, this gross is translated as great, being much too great to see the things in detail. Okay, so what are my conclusions from all of this? In order to be considered good during the Soviet period, a translation had to be accessible for the general masses. Therefore, it had to be fluent, it had to meet the tradition, the expectations, the tastes of the readers. Fluency was praised more than faithfulness to the original. Often this was expressed in such words: the translation reads as natural as if it were not a translation but an original Russian text. A clear example of domestication. In this atmosphere, Gnedic, who put the fluency first, won over Szengely, who besides had the misfortune of showing Byron's not always complimentary depiction of the Russian army, and specifically of Suvorov. As a result, Gnedic's translation has by now become the one and only proper translation of Don Juan into Russian, while Szengely's translation has been practically forgotten. Thank you very much for your attention.